Hello, and in today's video we will be looking at the Walking Dead universe role-playing starter set. So I have done a few videos on this, and this is sort of my final video because I've actually played 2 sessions earlier this week, so a good 7-8 hours of play, and I think what I said in my earlier video still sort of holds true. However, I do have some observations having played the game. So the first thing is, as far as I can tell, every single player who took part in both sessions absolutely loved the session. They didn't necessarily all love the game though, and that was a little bit interesting to me, and I was like, well, what don't you like about it? And one of the impressions was obviously it was a bit brutal, which yes, it is. And another impression was sort of it's a little bit tactical and the threat rules were a bit wonky. So let's have a look at the contents of the starter set and sort of talk about that, having obviously played this game in anger now. Now, as I said, I actually still think these are a fairly decent set of rules for the Mutant Year Zero, but you have to sort of go in with sort of the right mindset, I think, because it is, after all, a Walking Dead game. So the first problem is you've got these lovely TV character PC sheets, but they're a bit of a wasted opportunity because they're not used by the adventure. I think the starter set would be improved by having 2 adventures. A very simple adventure that shows you all of the rules, but uses these TV character sheets, and then the Wolves Den rule adventure would also be, a perfectly fine addition to use the pre-generated characters, which are these lot here, and they're all really interesting characters. But there is a little sting in the tail, which is something else someone didn't like, is they are set up for sort of inter-player tension. So, some of them want to kill each other, some of them want to get away from each other, some of them will do anything to save the other character. And so this can create situations in play where you might have one player facing off against another. And that actually did happen in one of my play groups. And if you're not invested in that, then you're going to have a problem. So yeah, there's loads of them, as you can see. And they're for the Wolves Den, and I think they are interesting characters, and I quite enjoyed seeing what happened. But some of the players didn't enjoy that so much. Others absolutely loved it and lapped it up. And so you got a lot of paper here, but what's the value in the paper, I guess, is one of the criticisms I've seen for this starter set. And of course that really applies for the maps. So we've got this really great regional map, which I think would be really good for players trying to set up their own campaign, but it's of limited use, but I love to see it, and in a box set for me it makes sense. The maps that are really, in my opinion, a bit more of a problem are the actual tactical battle maps. Now, one criticism which I agree with is they're only one-sided, and in addition, although I've just referred to them as tactical battle maps, in my opinion they're not tactical. They don't have a grid. Positioning is not really that important. They're the wrong scale really to use big miniatures. I guess 6mm miniatures would probably fit on them quite well, but 28mm miniatures from, for example, Mantic Games, way too big. So these for me are more placeholders to give you a sense of place and to give you a rough idea of where things are and where you are relative to them. But they're not, for me, actually tactical battle maps. But I think because I was using a VTT, that really gave the impression they were. So we'll come back to the Wolves Den, but let's have a look at the rules themselves. Now, I think the production quality is fabulous, and the rules are actually a very interesting take on the Mutant Year Zero engine, but they did give some of my players pause for thought. But they weren't really sold on them, but I think that's because they're really focused, and this threat meter was one of the big headaches for several players, I think, possibly due to me not maybe explaining how it worked well enough, but equally there is a bit of an intrinsic wonkiness about the threat meter, partly because it's doing a lot, because you've effectively, the threat meter tracks how big the size of the zombie horde is, how aware of you it is, and whether it attacks you. And I think it's doing maybe a little bit too much heavy lifting for just one value. Now, obviously, in the rules it does talk about these other values, but, could we not have maybe had a tracker which said, here's your overall threat, and that threat then allows you to increase the size of the proximity or to trigger attacks. So, as I say, I think that is maybe both the most brilliant and the weakest aspect of these rules. The threat meter and your understanding of it can really sink or swim your game. Now, if we actually go into the rulebook, there are a very limited set of skills. So I need to find them. They're a bit further forward from here, I believe. Yes, so the skills. Now, there are only 9-ish skills, I want to say, and they are very, very focused. So we've got close combat, which is pretty obvious what that does. Endure is sort of enduring heat, cold, stress, basically. We've then got force, which is overpowering people. And then, you've got the other skills here. And the problem with them, and I think it was a real problem for a couple of players, was they're so focused on what I would call the things that matter from a point of view of, are you going to get stressed and are you going to generate threat? They don't have skills for cookery. They don't have skills for tracking as such. It's sort of abstracted away into the survival skill. And so in particular in the first session we played, it seemed only 2 or 3 of the skills really were of any use, and it felt maybe a bit limited to some of the players. But I think it's because they came at this game with a slightly different focus, where the only skills you need are the ones that, as I say, are going to generate stress or threat. It also meant that, as I say, we did some heavy lifting in the first session. So in the second session I did try and say, well, which skill do you want to use? Which skill do you think is appropriate? And try to get people to use more of the skills. So maybe the second group enjoyed a little bit more the game because of my experience with the first session. Now, let's say I don't have a problem with that, but some of my players did. And as I say, I guess it's for me, I've started leaning towards you don't need a skill for everything, which is something I really saw in the 80s and 90s, where games came out with like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of skills. And, I have the joke of, what's your skill at tying up your shoelaces? Well, how relevant is that for most sessions? Probably isn't. But yeah, good set of skills. We've also got health points over on the right here, and it can be really brutal. You can take 2 damage from a pistol, which will take you from unharmed to battered really quickly, which is pretty realistic, but in a role-playing game maybe it's a bit too realistic. It's a bit too savage. 2 shots and you're potentially dead, or at least picking up a critical injury, and that maybe is a bit too brutal for some people, but it is very thematic and it is sort of very realistic, really. Stress and anchors, again, maybe not quite so powerful in play, and of course at the end of a session you work out if you're shattered and all that, but where it felt a little bit sad is that the medicine skill didn't really seem to do a great deal, and also trying to get rid of stress was a little bit, wasn't great. But my second group again maybe benefited because they got rid of their stress. So how do you get stress? Well, you got a list here. So pushing a roll, getting bitten, running out of food, getting shot at. It's pretty easy to pick up stress dice. Now, one house rule you could make very simply, I think, is if you push a roll, if you don't have any stress, you get 1 stress. If you do have stress, you only pick up extra stress if you fail your roll or something like that, because it seemed really easy to gain lots and lots of stress dice, which meant, of course, later on it could be potentially very easy to pass a test or very easy to roll lots of zombie bite results, which of course would give me a GM lots of threat. And in my second group in particular, one of the player characters actually starts with a load of stress. So their very first roll of the game, they promptly rolled a load of zombie dice, and instantly things started escalating. So of course, in a panic, people started rolling. That generated more stress and therefore more threat. and I could have potentially killed off every single character in the very first scene of the game fairly easily. So possibly you might need to tweak that down. So as we can see, if you mess up, what things can go on, and as I say, the rules could be pretty brutal. So let's talk about the scenario then and how those rules actually played out for me. So the Wolves' Den, I think, is a pretty good adventure. I think the threat meter, it could make this scenario pretty deadly, but it is a one-shot, and therefore maybe it's not a problem. But it did make people say, I enjoyed this as a one-shot, I'm not sure I'd like to play this as a campaign game. And a few of the players are like, well, I enjoyed the experience, I'm really glad I played it. It's definitely not a game I'm going to buy. It's a game I'm definitely not going to run, and it's probably a game I don't want to play too often. And one of the problems with this Wolves' Den scenario is, as I say, it doesn't feature those TV character options. It's also of limited use. You enjoy it with multiple groups, but with the same group, there's only so much use you're going to get out of this. I think you could probably play this over 2 sessions and maybe get a third session where, depending on how well the first group did, another group or survivors of the first group go back to finish off the scenario. So you probably can get about 12 hours of entertainment out of this adventure. I played in one group 3 to 3.5 hours, and in the second group more like 4.5 hours. And both groups had a similar outcome, ironically, at the end point. Now, there's lots of really good background information here and lots of setup, but I think for a starter set, where it is a bit weak is it doesn't use all the skills readily, or it doesn't highlight all the skills. But I know how hard that is to do, so it's not a massive criticism. So the starting scene starts off pretty low key, and in the first group they explored this quite happily and moved on. The second group, as I say, I could have almost wiped them all out here because they had walkers coming from everywhere, because they pretty much got to something like threat 5 or 6 really, really quickly. So yeah, could have almost ended the game there. So obviously both groups did actually manage to escape and move on to Ravenhill, which of course I used to reset the stress and the threat for the groups. But be cautious with this. It's meant to just be sort of a stepping stone to get you off to Ravenhill, where things could get really deadly really quickly. There's lots of walkers, and there's some wolves who I really played up really well, I think, and particularly the second group again did benefit from my experience from the first group, and I really went to town with the walkers and the baddies on the second playthrough. Now there's not too many buildings here, but there's quite a lot to track, which building does or doesn't have a walker, what building does or doesn't have interesting things in it. And I quite enjoyed this, and the second group in particular probably spent half the session in this location exploring all the buildings. But the first group, they checked out the church, and then I think maybe they just breezed on by, and we ended up having a bit of a shootout with the baddies who ran out of the building, seeing the van coming down the road, whereas the second group had a big bun fight round buildings down the bottom here, 7, 8, 9 I think it was. Yeah, so about here we had walkers and baddies and running through the building, and it was all quite exciting and cinematic and great fun, and led to a player dying, I think roughly where these crashed cars were, and having to be left behind as basically a distraction for the walkers. And so they got really good use out of this scavenging table. The first group didn't, and then we got obviously some bits here about messing up. And then you get to Evergreen itself, where the baddies are. Very similar experience for both groups. The second group took a bit longer maybe to be kicked into action, but they, like the first group, decided to steal the truck and break through into the barricades and unleash loads of walkers, and bedlam occurred. But the second group in particular got really into a bit of PvP. The first group got into PvP, the second group not so much, and very amusing that both groups had a similar outcome with the first group returning to base and then realising one of them had got bitten and turning into a walker, whereas the second group saw someone get bitten, thought it was a problem, but decided to get into the van and bug out of there. And of course I said, well, as we fade to black, they die and rise again as a walker, and you've now got a walker in a van, whilst, like a couple of the characters are hugging them. And yeah, really, really good. So I think this adventure delivers on the promise of the game, which is you are going to play in a savage universe where the dead walk, and it therefore does a really good job of being The Walking Dead. If you're not a fan of The Walking Dead, you're probably not going to enjoy this game so much. If you don't like a potentially pretty brutal game, you're not going to like it so much. I think it does a pretty good job. I think you might be better off buying the PDF version rather than the physical box set though. Particularly if you've got Foundry or Roll20 or something like that, and you can use the digital assets. I don't think it's a tactical game. I just keep seeing people saying it's a tactical game. I really disagree with that. But, is it perfect? Possibly not. I still stand by it is one of the better versions of the Mutant Year Zero engine. The wonkiness, though, is the threat meter, and I think probably I didn't do a good enough job at explaining how that worked to the players, and therefore for some of them it felt a bit arbitrary, a bit random, a bit too abstract, and that's fair enough. So I don't think it's a game that's going to appeal to everyone, but I enjoyed it. And as I said to one of my play groups, the Walker review of this is fantastic restaurant, ate really well, 2 desiccated, chewed arms up. So watch out for the threat meter. Make sure you really understand the rules for that. Maybe I still need to get my head around that myself. And be aware that this scenario is of limited use, but you can reuse the maps in other scenarios, so they're not totally worthless. But yeah, this is what it is. It's a starter set. It's a taster. It's a little, amuse-bouche, and a little appetizer to get you interested in the full game. I think it's going to work really well for one-shots. It's going to be a little bit harder, obviously, for campaign games, but I think for me it is money's well spent. I've already had several hours of fun from reading it, filming it, and obviously playing it, and so I've probably got my money's worth out of this set. Other players and other groups, maybe not. I do know there are some issues that people have with it. They feel it's too light in some areas but too crunchy in others, and it sort of for them isn't the correct balance. It's too crunchy when it should be light, and it's not crunchy enough. So I'm not sure I 100% agree with that. It's very much a personal opinion thing, and as I say, I can see this being a bit of a Marmite game. Probably my favourite version of Mutant Year Zero, I feel, is Mutant Year Zero itself. This sits more towards the Alien scale for me, where interplayer tension is important, certain death is highly likely, and one-shots work really well. Campaign games, a little bit trickier, maybe 8 to 10 connected adventures and then your particular campaign is over. But if you run a community rather than individual players, then maybe that's where a campaign works. So you're tracking the success of a community in which players reside. But that's something the starter set doesn't really deliver on, and you're going to need the full rules for that. So overall, good game, but approach with caution. There are dead inside.